All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. Everyone feeling good? Feeling ready? Great. All right, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for today's IM Online. This is our monthly webinar focused around identity and access management and is brought to you by InCommon and Internet 2. My name is Netta Caligari. I am the InCommon Community Success Manager here through Internet 2, and I'm so happy to introduce our host, Rob, in just a moment. But just for a few housekeeping notes, we will be taking questions and comments live during the Zoom chat function. We really do encourage your participation and want you to get as much as you can out of the session. So please send any thoughts, feedback, or questions via the chat, and we'll be moderating that throughout the presentation. Just make sure when you are posting your question that it is being sent to everybody to make sure that the host and the presenter see it, or at very least make sure that you're sending it to all of the presenters so we have our eyes on that. We are, as you can see, also recording the webinar, so this will be posted on our IM Online YouTube channel in the coming days. And again, we just want you to enjoy, listen in, learn, and we've got a great session lined up for you today. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Rob Carter. He is a middleware architect at Duke University and the 2021 chair for our CACTI Advisory Committee, and he'll talk a little about what is that. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Rob. Thank you.
I'm going to see if I can share the slides properly. Get this thing started. All right, can everybody see the slides? Excellent. All right, then we can get started here. So thank you, Netta. And again, thanks everybody for joining us for the IM Online. Today we're going to hopefully talk about secrets, supply chains, and securing trust in the new normal, whatever that means. And hopefully by the time we're done, you'll at least know what we're talking about. So before we get started, a couple of things we need to cover. I wanted to introduce all of our speakers. Netta was kind enough to introduce me, but I'll introduce the other three that are going to be speaking today. We have with us Matthew Economou, who's the Chief of Identity Products from Research Data and Communication Technologies. Matthew was kind enough to step in at the last minute for one of our other CACTI members, Josh Drake, who was originally going to speak with us today, but wasn't able to make it because of some personal conflicts that came up. So we appreciate Josh's input early on and appreciate Matthew coming to speak with us today. Also, we have with us Carl Waldbieser, who's a systems programmer from the Information Technology Services Group at Lafayette College. He's going to talk some about the cool stuff that's been going on at Lafayette recently. And then last but not least, we have Nicole Roy, who's the Director of Technology and Strategy for InCommon. I'm sure many of you are familiar with her. She's going to speak to us about some of the cool stuff that's going on inside Internet 2 and InCommon and the Trusted Access platform. Also, before we get going too far, I want to make one quick note that this is not necessarily going to be like the IAM Onlines that you've been involved in before. Most IAM Onlines focus on a specific solution to a particular problem, and that's not really where we're going to go today. Today, we're going to be looking at the intersection between trust and security, some of the evolving issues that we see coming down the pike there. And while we'll talk about some very good practices that are going on, some good strategies that are being used both inside Internet 2 and out in the community, we're not really going to focus on trying to hand you solutions to things. We know there are a lot of questions outstanding, and we know we don't have the answers to all of them. So at the end of the talk today, we're actually going to talk to you as a community about how you can get involved and help participate in us finding collectively the answers to the questions that we're going to raise today. So I've said we a bunch of times, and Netta sort of touched on the fact that we're sort of here from the CACTI group. So what is CACTI? Well, CACTI is the Internet 2 Community Architecture Committee for Trust and Identity, CACTI. That's where the acronym comes from. We're chartered by the Vice President for Trust and Identity inside Internet 2 as one of a small number of standing advisory committees that provide support to the Trust and Identity program inside I2. We have 13 official members, all of them from inside the community, all of us nominated from inside the community. 3 of our members this year are from outside the US and 10 are from inside the US. And we represent all different segments of the sort of higher ed and research community. We've got representatives from R1s, like myself, from Duke, from teaching colleges, as well as from federation operators, research organizations, commercial service providers, and even some standards organizations, if we think about it the right way. We're chartered, as I said, by the vice president at Internet2 to provide architectural input and strategic input to the Trust and Identity program and all of the projects and activities that it's involved in. But we're also chartered to share information about trust and identity with the community at large. And that's largely why we're here today, to talk about stuff that we think is important in the space of trust and identity for the community to hear about. We also have the ability, I'll note this now, to charter community working groups to help us do what we think needs to be done. And as I mentioned earlier, we're going to talk at the end a little bit about how you might be able to participate. And one of the ways that we may be able to give you to participate in what we're trying to do is to join a working group. And we'll talk a bit about that later. So why exactly is it that we're here? What is it we want to talk about? Well, in essence, what we want to talk about is this dependency model that you see on the left-hand side of the slide there. What's this about? Well, sort of walking down from the top to the bottom, our community inside R&E, as everybody knows, depends really intensely on identity and access management, and particularly on federated identity and access management. I don't think any of us necessarily need to be reminded about that. What we do want to remind ourselves about, though, is that this federated identity and access management stuff that we're doing depends on trust. That's not really hard to see, right? We have to trust each other. We have to trust the federation, at least as far as federated identity is concerned. Our users have to trust that we're doing the right things with our identity systems. But beyond that, it depends on trust in the software and the services and the systems that we're using to deliver the identity and access management products to the end users, right? Now, that trust, in turn, as we follow down the dependency chain, depends on security. And this is kind of the thing that we want to focus on today, that if we want to maintain trustworthiness in the services that we're providing up to the community, we have to address security issues that underlie that trust, right? It's not rocket science, but this is something that maybe we don't always think about. I think it's easy at times for us to get really focused at the top of that stack on trying to make things work, trying to make sure that the community gets the services that they need. And that is terribly important. But if we're not careful to also make sure that those services are trustworthy, we haven't really done our jobs. And that's the thing that we sort of want to reinforce today and bring to folks' attention. Now, the other thing that we want to note is that the way that we go about providing these services seems to be changing. And that's the thing that CACTI has sort of noticed in recent days, that as these things are changing, we think that the strategies we need to use to maintain the security that underlies the trust that's necessary to make the federation work are changing. We think we have to change the way that we address security in order to maintain trust. So if that's what we're talking about, basically that, you know, security matters, why, you might ask, is it that we're talking about this now? Why didn't we come in and talk about it a year ago? Why don't we wait a couple of years when things are quieter and talk about it later? Well, I think we can probably all agree that the last 18 months or so have not been normal. They haven't been like the previous 18 months, certainly, or really any 18 months that I've seen in my career. And this new normal that we now find ourselves in as a result, to a large extent, of the pandemic, has involved a lot of changes in the way that we do business, changes in the way that we work, changes in the way that we learn and teach learners, changes in the way that we deliver services. And all of those changes, many of which have been accelerated, they maybe weren't caused by the pandemic, but they may have started before the pandemic and moved faster because we had to adapt to the pandemic. All of these changes have adjusted, I'll say, the attack surfaces for our infrastructures, and they've changed the way that the attackers are interacting with our infrastructures. And both of these things mean that if we want to maintain security, we have to approach things a little bit differently. So CACTI was watching all of these changes as they sort of developed through 2020. And at the end of 2020, sort of at the beginning of 2021, we started noticing a constellation really of security events, largely outside research and education, but they were important to us. SolarWinds was probably the one that everyone's heard about. SolarWinds was very public. It was widely discussed, but it was just one of a series of compromises that we observed that are of a similar sort. And looking at these, we realize that they underscore the importance, for us at least, of making sure that we understand how the changes that are going on in our environments and in the security infrastructures underneath them are changing what we need to be doing to keep trust in our services. So with that sort of as background, I will hand this off to Matthew now, who gets to talk to us a little bit more in detail about the stuff that you see on the slide there, and hopefully lead us into sort of the next section of the conversation. So Matt, I will turn it over to you and flip to your slide, and it's all yours.
The COVID-19 pandemic drove a number of changes in identity and access management over the last 18 months. So I mean, remote work and remote instruction, those challenged already stressed network perimeter security infrastructure, firewalls and VPNs and so forth. To avoid and to address some of these issues, organizations accelerated their move to cloud solutions, both software and infrastructure as a service. And this really breaks the castle and moat model of perimeter security. This new zero trust model, the perimeter is the identity and access management system. Securing the systems, software, processes that provide IAM services then becomes even more crucial, because where the network and related infrastructure were once prime targets for attack, the IAM environment is now even more attractive a target. And due to its exposure, I mean, it has to be outside, internet accessible, it's more vulnerable. Next slide, please. The SolarWinds hack entailed the exploitation of a weak and exposed secret in a seemingly low-value target, part of the SolarWinds software supply chain. And that was used to inject backdoors into software trusted by numerous downstream customers. Those customers' trusted systems then became targets for compromise. And with those trusted systems being afforded high authorization access to critical infrastructure, including SAML identity providers, customer sites, what started as a simple secret compromise in a small part of the vendor's supply chain turned into something much more serious. A lot of focus was placed on this golden ticket effect. And what that is the ability of an attacker who compromises a private key used to sign, for example, SAML assertions. That's used to impersonate any user in a relying party by forging assertions using the IDP's keys. And while that's true, we might note that the issue is not restricted to SAML. It's not restricted to federated identity in general. The compromise of an SSL server private key, the compromise of a sealing or encryption key, or really any other private key can have similar effects in other systems. The bottom line is our identity services ultimately depend on cryptographic security, which in turn depends on private keys remaining private. Next slide, please. SolarWinds got quite a bit of popular press attention around the start of the year, but since that time, there have been multiple similar incursions that have affected or that have gotten somewhat less publicity, but have been just as impactful for the sites or organizations they affected. In an ethically questionable research project, some security researchers at UMN attempted to inject vulnerabilities into the Linux kernel, ostensibly to see whether or how the Linux kernel team would detect the injection. Now, they caught it through their normal review processes, and the university actually lost their commit rights to the kernel as a result. CodeCov and Kaseya, these are cloud-based management tools. CodeCov is used by developers as code coverage testing tools, and Kaseya is a system administration tooling. Both of these vendors suffered SolarWinds-like supply chain incursions later this year. Kaseya just this month, or just last month. Next slide, please. A few common threads emerge when we consider the shifting landscape and this recent spate of events. As sites move to embrace cloud-based services, traditional boundaries matter less, and IAM becomes even more critical component in an organization's overall security approach. Likewise, IAM becomes an even more attractive target for attackers who can no longer storm the castle. There is no castle. There's like a million castles. They're everywhere. There's a castle everywhere an organization's data is hosted by a third party. So the days of vandalism by non-experts are long gone. Attackers are now likely to be experts and well-funded at that. They can afford to attack a low-value target in the hopes of using that to bootstrap an attack on a higher value target later. That's exactly what we saw with SolarWinds. Our own operational models are changing as well. We're shifting from running integrated software packages on bespoke systems on premises, and we're running these orchestrated containerized services. And it's a mixture. Some of it's on premises, some of it's in the cloud. Or we're integrating them with software as a service offerings provided by third parties. And those are totally outside of our control. Our software development processes are increasingly sophisticated, and they require these automated build and deploy pipelines that themselves can involve containers, infrastructure that's on premises, infrastructure that's in the cloud. Even our security tooling is becoming cloud-based and highly distributed. CrowdStrike's a good example of that. Secrets, often distinct secrets, are used at every hop along the software supply and trust chain. And those are used to secure the different exchanges among all the actors in the supply chain. And every link in that software supply chain can add both attack targets and opportunities to expose secrets unintentionally, often with disastrous consequences. These changes increase attack surface in some ways. Now, attackers can go after CI/CD pipelines, and attackers can target secrets inadvertently embedded in containers that are shared through cloud services, or accidentally shared in code on Git repositories. Or they can attack the tools used in the software supply chains themselves, rather than just the final trusted software systems they ultimately populate. This new normal is breeding a new model for sophisticated attacks that start with compromising secrets somewhere along a supply chain or trust chain, then using those secrets to violate trust further down the line. We've long understood that security is a process and not a product, or a state of being. And these new developments make the task of remaining vigilant even harder. We have more secrets to protect in more places. We have more dependencies to validate. We have more depending on our IAM infrastructure than ever before as well. Along with the new risks we're incurring, though, we have new capabilities and new strategies for avoiding and mitigating them. Rob?
Get myself back off mute so I can pick up again. All right. Thank you, Matthew. That was excellent. And sort of pulling together those common threads at the end of what Matthew was just talking about now. If we think about it, as we did in CACTI, we can sort of imagine a couple of high-level areas of concern. If we sort of bubble these things together, we can imagine a couple of high-level areas that we need to be concerned about. The first one, I think, is that we have to think about addressing security at all different levels, all the way from the beginning to the end of the supply chain, from where we create the software and how we create the software, down to where we're running the software and how we're maintaining it while it's being executed. This new environment that we find ourselves in, as Matthew pointed out, really doesn't admit of hardening the castle and ignoring the fields outside, because everything is everywhere. We have to be vigilant across the entire across the entire scope. We need to make sure that since our environment depends on these long supply chains with lots and lots of critical dependencies throughout them, that we're getting our software from trustable sources, that our software itself is trustable, and that we're operating it in a trustable fashion. And it's not just what we're doing individually. We have to make sure that our vendor partners, our community partners, the folks that we're interacting with are doing those same things, at least to the extent that we can. We need to be aware of what they're doing. This is what we owe to ourselves. This is what we owe to each other. And we also have to recognize that in order to do all of that, there's critical importance in trying to protect and manage the secrets that essentially are the basis for all of the trust and security along these supply chains. So all of our security, as Matthew pointed out, depends largely on cryptography, and that depends on secrets, things that something or someone knows that no one else should. We need to make sure that we're doing the right things to generate good secrets. We need to make sure that we're limiting the exposure of those secrets as much as possible to potential attack. We need to make sure that we're addressing all of the secrets, not just passwords that we've been worried about for years, but also things like signing and encryption keys, SSL keys, OAuth tokens that may be used to authorize access from one system to another system, because these are the things that the attackers are starting to go after now. Frequently, this kind of security entails using strong cryptography, and we will see some more about that going forward, both for encrypting data at rest and for dealing with things like SSL tunneling. We also need to think about how we're getting secrets into the software that we're using. And so mechanisms for doing secret injection into software are getting more and more important. And we'll talk about some of that in a while too. Above all, I think as Matthew noted, we have to make sure that we remember that security is an ongoing process. It's not a state of being. And it's something that we just have to worry about everywhere all the time, sadly. So I'll hand off the baton now to Nicole and Carl, who are going to talk a little bit about the good stuff that's going on. We've spent some time talking about what the threats are. Now let's talk a little bit about how we're addressing those threats. So let me switch slides here. And Nicole, I think you're up next.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Rob. So hi, I'm Nicole Roy. I'm the Director of Technology and Strategy at InCommon. My team does a lot of the service engineering for the parts of InCommon trust services, trust and identity services the Internet 2 provides to the community and runs on the community's behalf. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about what we do within InCommon Operations, as well as how the community helps itself and the role of InCommon in sort of facilitating that. And then finally, how we take the things that we learn from those places where we have contact with the community, where the community participates and defines its own requirements, and we plow that stuff back into the components themselves and the way that we deliver them securely. So InCommon Operations, when people think about what InCommon Operations does, it's, you know, the sort of poster child for that is probably providing services to the InCommon SAML Federation, the thing that people log into to manipulate their SAML metadata, how they configure their identity provider and service provider deployments to get signed metadata securely and verify that signature. Those things and more are part of the portfolio of services that my team helps to deliver. We work very, very closely with the community to understand the security dynamics and, you know, on top of that, the trust dynamics that factor into how we provide those services in a secure way. So every time we roll out a new service or modify a service in a significant way, we're talking to our governance groups like the InCommon Technical Advisory Committee, the TAC, CACTI, which I am the flywheel for, the staff flywheel for that group, the Community Trust and Assurance Board, the EDROM Advisory Committee, all those things. We get the requirements from the community and then we engineer them specifically into those services. We have a security lead and we work very closely with other security professionals, both within Internet 2 and in the community, to make sure that we're doing defense in depth rather than relying on perimeter security. Matthew drew your attention to the need for zero trust practices, and we are working to engineer those into the services that we provide. I won't go into specifics. You can find other previous instances of IAM online where we talk about some of the really cool things that we do to engineer that security into our service offerings. But suffice to say, you know, we're following along in the community's footsteps and working to understand how to build software in a more secure way through things like test coverage, auditing tools, audit process automation, and continuous process improvement. Next slide, please, Rob. Okay, so as I sort of alluded to on the previous slide, we really depend on the community to lead the way on this stuff. So working groups and governance bodies are incredibly important to us in that regard. Standards like the Security Incident Response Trust Framework for Federated Identity. That's a distributed security incident handling model that is intended to be lightweight, easily applied, and basically globally applicable, and is part of the requirements of the InCommon Baseline Expectations version 2 program, which is underway right now. And both of those things were created by the community to address its own needs, the needs of the researchers who are relying on these federations. Additionally, the community has developed mechanisms for feedback to itself and policing of itself. And those things include arbitration processes. So if I see that my neighbor is behaving badly, I can try and resolve the issue with that identity provider, service provider, federation operator, et cetera, directly, and then I can escalate if I need to. Next slide, please. Okay, and then we take the knowledge that we gain from working groups like the software packaging working group, the software integration working group, the best practices that are being developed within community deployments, within the deployments of the software that we have at Internet2 for our own use, basically drinking our own champagne. And we engineer those back into the containers and the components that we deliver to the community. And we work very closely with the software architects that develop those components, things like Grouper, Shibboleth, CoManage, and Midpoint. And it's really important that the community plays an active role in identifying those best practices. So it's critical for people to participate in those working groups and to consider participating in governance groups. If there's an activity that you're really involved in, you really depend on a component, it's a great idea to look for ways to get involved. And not just ask questions, but you can actually offer potential solutions as well. So that's sort of it in a nutshell. I'm going to pass the baton to Carl.
Hi, my name is Carl Walbieser. I'm with Lafayette College. I'm the systems programmer there, and I'm also on the identity and access management team. Recently, over the last year or so, Lafayette College has been moving a lot of its on-premises infrastructure and workloads into public cloud infrastructure. And during that migration, it forced us to really think about some of the new ways we need to manage our resources as we make this migration. On premises, for example, we had credentials for databases, service accounts. They were all in some kind of human readable configuration files on various hosts. That host space access was in place. So, you had to have a username and password or SSH key or something to get onto the host. And even before that, you had your perimeter, you had to be able to get into our network before you could reach the host because it was in the protected network. And then once you were on the host, to read the file that the secret was in, you had file system permissions. And you might have even had something like a mandatory access control system like SE Linux or something that would prevent you from reading that unless you were specifically allowed. But now that we're migrating to the cloud, the file system may very well be ephemeral. So storing any kind of configuration, let alone secrets, isn't always an option in the same way that we might have done it on premises. Fortunately, our public cloud infrastructure provider is AWS, and they provide some dedicated managed services for configuration and secret management. And some of these services are managed by the provider to the extent that we don't even have to worry about the secret at all. And I'll give an example of it later. So first off, AWS provided us with a service called Secrets Manager, but aptly named. and it allows you to store either plain text or binary secrets in it. And then these can be retrieved by workloads programmatically using an API, and they need to have an authorized role that you give it in order to get the secret. And there's a couple different strategies for using it. Probably the most basic kind is that you are going to like use some kind of like little glue code at execution time to retrieve the secret during your initialization process of a workload. And then you would take the secret that you retrieved and plug it into your process wherever it makes sense. For example, we have Fargate workloads, which are they're containerized workloads that are managed by AWS, and they start up their initialization of the container by downloading the secrets, and then they put them wherever the secret needs to be on that temporary file system within the container. Also, AWS has their secret manager integrated with some of their other services. So if you don't feel comfortable writing that glue code, they actually will do that for you. So with a similar example with their Elastic Container Service, it allows you to configure environment variables with static values, or you can give it the name of a secret that you have. And as long as you've assigned the correct permission policy to that container execution role, it can go out to Secrets Manager and retrieve that secret for you and store it in an environment variable on your behalf. And as long as your workload can retrieve the secret from an environment variable, you're all set. You didn't have to write any code to do that, so it's totally hands-off. Another way you can use Secrets Manager, which we found effective, is that you can build your secret into the image that you're building, for example, for a container, at build time using your CI/CD pipeline. And we've done this in at least one instance I can think of, where the CI/CD pipeline, in the process of building, your containerized image, it will look up the secret at that point and kind of burn it in to the image. And then that image is encrypted, and it has to be authorized by the container service to retrieve it. And then once it does retrieve it and runs your container, you're all set. Another service that AWS provides in order to manage secrets is their certificate manager. This basically allows you to create as many public certificates as you want that integrate with some of their other services, like their Elastic Load Balancer or their API gateway. And the great part about this service is that the private keys are managed entirely by AWS. So as an operator, I never really have to deal with the private key management. I don't have to rotate them. They're automatically rotated. That's another thing that Secret Manager will allow you to do too, is you can set up automatic rotation of your secrets. This isn't always something that we do, because some of the secrets we use are used by external systems where you would have to have some sort of coordination to rotate the secret, like usually for like a non-integrated service. Like if I am running a containerized open LDAP or something like that, I may have to coordinate the rotation of the secret there. But that's my story, and I can hand it over to the next person at this time.
Okay, thanks. So to kind of tie everything together, you've heard from Matthew and Rob a bit about how the threat landscape has really changed significantly within the last, say 5-6 years, as well as the way that we're deploying solutions, both centrally within InCommon Operations, as well as the distributed deployments at internet or InCommon participant places such as Lafayette, right? The deployment models needed to change. That highlights that this is an interconnected ecosystem, and that's just the reality of the world we live in. We're not going back to a place where people can do work in isolation. Everything is interdisciplinary, and not just interdisciplinary within a single institution, but across institutional boundaries and across the boundaries of countries. You've got huge global research efforts like the Large Hadron Collider, gravitational wave observatories, arts and humanities research, linguistics research, and then health research like the NIH. All of these things require very, very high levels of security. And because of the trust landscape that Matthew described, a risk to one is effectively multiplied as a risk to all. So if you put those two things together, we're in a pretty challenging position. But using tools and techniques that are similar to, if not identical to, what Carl described, we can protect ourselves, and in doing so, we effectively help to protect everyone else. These are, the same kinds of patterns that we're using within InCommon Operations. They're the same kinds of patterns that you're going to learn about if you do something like join the InCommon Collaboration Success Partners Program and work with others to help bootstrap your identity and access management environment. And with that, I think I turn it back over to Rob.
Throw up my slide and then figure out how to get back off mute again. So thank you, Nicole and Carl. So this is kind of the transitional slide into the last portion of the presentation. So sort of what we've heard story-wise so far is, the world is changing. We know about COVID. The pandemic has caused a lot of changes, but we've also seen changes in the way that we're doing business as a result of trying to address the challenges brought forth by the pandemic. And we've seen the attackers changing their behaviors. But at the same time, we've seen adaptations on the part of individual campuses and individual participants inside the InCommon Federation, doing good work like they're doing at Lafayette to address security issues in this new world that we find ourselves in. We also see that Internet 2 is doing good stuff. InCommon's doing good stuff. The Trusted Access folks are doing good stuff. And all of this makes us really happy inside CACTI. Right? We're glad to see that we as a community, at least in those areas, seem to be maturing along with the evolution of both the threat environment and the service providing environment that we find ourselves in. On the whole, I think, and I'm going to knock on wood here, hopefully that wasn't too loud in the microphone, but I think we have so far done really well as far as being successful at keeping our cyber infrastructures and our federation in general secure and trustworthy. I don't think we've had a lot of severe incidents in that regard, and I hope we won't have any in the future. Certainly. But what we want to do sort of from the CACTI perspective is try to push that forward, right? We've had good successes in the past. We're doing good things now. We want to make sure we keep doing things going forward. And since we know all of this is evolving, we know we're going to have to make some changes and do some work in order to do that. So to that end, I think we've called out just a handful of areas where we think some additional study or some additional work, maybe just some more attention from the community could be fruitful. And I'm going to cover some of those now before I hit the final slide and start asking you to help us out. So, oops, if I can get my screen to let me do this. There we go. So what are the things that we think we can make get some traction under and make some progress in quickly? Well, so as we sort of heard from Carl and Nicole, we've had really good progress so far in trying to secure sort of the immediate supply chain for things like the Trusted Access Platform software and some of our campus deployments of IAM solutions. But where we think we can probably make more progress is to take some of the good stuff that we've done centrally, that we've done inside the Federation operations space, and push those out into the participant space, right? Start using some of that good stuff that we know how to do from operating our central stuff a little bit better out in the outlying regions. There's this group called the Federated Identity Management for Research Group. There's a collection of folks from largely big science and some other sort of research areas that get together occasionally and talk about federated identity and how it affects research and what research needs from federated identity in general, what they need us in a sense to do. And they call themselves FIM4R. So FIM4R did a report a couple of years ago now that CACTI actually wrote a response to in response to their report. But the report had a long list of things that they thought were important, the things that they needed essentially. And one of the things they called out was that one of the primary impediments to the research organizations taking better advantage of federated identity was a lack of certainty on the part of the researchers about the security practices that are being used both inside the Federation centrally and particularly among the participants within the Federation. A lot of this, we imagine, probably just comes from a lack of transparency, right? That we're doing good things out in the field, but we're not doing a good job of making sure that people know that we're doing good things. And if they don't know, it's hard for them to trust, right? It's not enough necessarily to be secure. We have to be known to be secure in order to have that level of trust that we need to make the Federation work properly. And it's also not always clear that when folks aren't doing necessarily the best thing that they could be doing, it's clear to them or to everyone else that there's an issue that needs to be addressed somewhere. And so we realize it's probably not going to be possible to get absolute transparency at a granular level. But what we do think is maybe some additional monitoring and aggregated statistics gathering within the Federation might be useful. If we do a better job of telling ourselves how collectively we're doing, of measuring how we're doing on sort of security level scores within the Federation, not at an individual level, again, but at the aggregate, right? How well is the Federation doing meeting targets for use of good encryption technology, verification of metadata signatures at all the appropriate points, things like that. We think that sort of information, if we could make it more public and more available, would be useful in achieving higher levels of trust, and that would help us get the research folks more involved. Additionally, we've had questions from the research folks about what's going on as far as security is concerned among the participants, but we've also heard rumblings inside CACTI, I think, from some quarters about whether the trusted access platform software is really trustable, whether the trusted access platform stuff is doing the right things. And as Nicole pointed out, and Carl sort of hinted at as well, I think a lot of that is already taken care of. Part of the problem, though, is that while the folks creating the trusted access platform software are doing a bang-up job of getting it right, doing the right things to adapt to this new normal that we find ourselves in, to them, that's just the normal way of doing business. They don't talk about it a whole lot because they just assume that's what they have to do. And we think that probably there's a sort of communications gap there in that the community doesn't have that sort of warm, fuzzy feeling that would come from hearing about all the cool security related stuff that's going on inside the trusted access platform, for example. So we think that doing some work to try to expose that good stuff that we're doing a little bit better within the community is going to be useful. Nicole mentioned the Campus Success Program, the CSP. That's been a really good vehicle for trying to convey some of that information, but unfortunately, it's got some limitations because it can only reach a certain number of sites, a certain number of customers in a given year because it's only got so many slots available. So we think having some further conversations at things like Basecamp, Camp and A Camp that's coming up, TechX in October. We think that these are going to be good ways for us to start conveying that. And also I'll note the fact that we're here today to talk about this is in part because we think it's important to try to get that out. And so hopefully we're conveying that as we go through this. So the third thing that I think is worth noting, as a community, we've got an awful lot of lore. We're almost like an old style guild in a way. There's a lot of lore associated with being in the IAM space inside research and education. And that's a good thing, right? This lore that we have about how to do what we do, about how best to run certain software that we all use, how best to interoperate with the Federation, things like that. It's grown up organically within the community, and that's a great way to develop that. And because the community has been, because the problems that we've seen in the community itself has been evolving and maturing slowly, that lore has evolved and matured with it in a sort of organic fashion, and that's worked out really well. And for the most part, we've communicated this amongst ourselves, this kind of lore, in a pretty ad hoc fashion. It's been, you run into someone at a meeting and you have a conversation about it, or you go read a blog entry somewhere about it, or you run into something on a wiki that you didn't realize was there to talk about something that you're interested in. As we move into this new normal, though, the pace of change seems to be increasing. And as the pace of change increases, I think some of these mechanisms that we've traditionally used start to break down. Further, the changes that we've all experienced as part of the pandemic in the way that we work, the fact that we're all more remote now, that we don't have these person-to-person interactions as much as we used to, makes some of the organic mechanisms harder to promulgate. And ultimately, we think that the lore that we have from the last 10 or 15 years is starting to get a little bit stale because of these changes that we've talked about so far in the presentation, which means that we need to get some new lore, but we may not be able to generate it the way we've always generated it. We think a little bit more structure around how we develop this stuff may be in order. And that brought CACTI to sort of realize two major gaps that we think we need to address. One of them is simply that we probably need to make a more organized effort to try to develop new best practices, new information about sort of good practices, if not best practices. Sometimes we can't always define something as a best practice, but we can identify something as, we know that works. We know it works well. We don't know if it's the best thing we can do, but we do know that it works well. And so we thought, we need to do some stuff to try to help this along, maybe organize some conversations. And that led CACTI to think about, okay, well, we'll organize some conversations. Where should we have them? What's the right forum for us to carry on this conversation going forward? We realized, looking at the committee structure that we have in place now, there's not really anywhere that's the perfect fit for having this kind of conversation about these things. Certainly, as Nicole mentioned, if you are interested in joining up with one of the Trusted Access Platform workstream working groups, that's a great way to get involved, especially at a deep level. But that alone is probably not going to be enough to carry forward the conversation. And that leads us to my last slide, which is where we make the final ask to you as a community, right? So CACTI came here initially just to try to raise awareness, to try to make sure that everybody is focused on these issues, to make sure that everybody is aware of these issues and aware of what we're doing to try to address the issues. But we're also here to solicit your input and your participation. CACTI is considering chartering, got to use that word properly, chartering some working groups to try and build a place for these conversations to carry on going forward. There are lots of different places that we might charter those working groups, or different directions we might send those working groups in. We don't have those pinned down just yet. At this point, what we know is we think we need to build some forums for these conversations to carry on, and we have some idea of what the conversations probably need to look like, but we don't have the detailed charters put together yet. So what's our ask? If you're interested in participating with us or with a working group working on any of this stuff, if any of what we've talked about today struck a chord with you and seemed interesting, or is something that you look at and go, oh, I could fix that. Or else it's something you look at and say, that's been bothering me too. We'd like to hear about it. We'd like to know that you're interested. And there in the next to last bullet item on the screen, you'll see the email address that you can use to contact CACTI, cacti-inquiry@internet2.edu. If you're interested in helping us out with this, if you're interested in getting involved in some fashion, we'd love to hear from you. If you let us know that you're interested at any level, we'll be happy to keep you apprised of developments as we put things together and start spinning out working groups. We'll be happy to try to invite you to come get involved with us. If that seems like too much work, if you're not sure that you've got the time or the inclination to try to get involved at that level, that's okay. We understand that. Everybody's busy and we've all got our lives to try to deal with. At least consider maybe signing up to come to camp and ACamp, to TechX in October. We're going to have conversations about this at least during the ACamp section. I think we're going to have some touching on it during camp. And if we get the opportunity to have hallway conversations in this virtual world somehow, I imagine some of this will come up in those conversations as well. And finally, if that's not even something that you personally are interested in, or not something that you think you would be inclined to do, but you know somebody within your organization that's the right person to tap to get involved in this, by all means, share the recording of this IAM online with them, share that email address with them, tell them to get involved. The fact that you're here today is great, but it doesn't have to be just you. If you know somebody else that would be a better fit for talking about this than you feel like you are, by all means, socialize it. And what we want is participation. So with that, I will go back to our title slide, and Netta, I guess I'll give it back to you and see if there are questions or anything that we need to address before we close out.
Sounds good, thank you. Looking here, I don't see any questions, but we still have some time. So if anybody does have last minute questions that they would like addressed for the content that was covered here, we certainly can address that before we hop off. Give just a second to see if anybody has anything.
One thing I guess I'd like to draw attention to is something that Rob mentioned towards the end of his most recent segment, which is really this theme of broadening the tent and making sure that more people see this IM online than are able to attend live today. That's really critical. Part of the mission of CACTI is to sort of help broaden the tent of people that are involved in the activities that help make the trust chain that the community depends on better and stronger. And we really need the participation of security professionals, active participation of security professionals. In addition, we understand that those of us who are identity and access management practitioners, we need to meet those folks halfway. So a recent example that would be like Mary McKee from Duke and Mark Rank from Cirrus Identity, who both participate in the InCommon Technical Advisory Committee. They reached out to folks at HISC, RENI, SAC, and EDUCAUSE to see if the TAC could contribute to the newest version of the HECVAT vendor assessment tool to help improve the requirements around single sign-on security practices there. So that's just one example. We are needing to sort of actively do that outreach as well. But I think it's really important for those that are able to attend today to be thinking about how that applies to your own environment, to your colleagues, to your spheres of influence and beyond. And those are, I think, things that will be really interesting to talk about in these upcoming opportunities that Rob has highlighted.
Thanks, Nicole. Okay, well, if we do not have any other questions, we can still keep a lookout if anything rolls in last minute. But we can go ahead without further ado, I guess, wrap up IM Online. So just to start, many, many thanks to Rob, Carl, Matthew, and Nicole for this awesome presentation. And really thanks to all of you who attended as well. This is really great content. And again, because it's recorded, like Nicole says, we really want to broaden the tent. So this will be recorded, or sorry, excuse me, this recording will be posted on our IM Online YouTube channel. And then feel free to share that link with whoever might be interested in this conversation as well. Before we go ahead and log off, just a couple of things to note. So as you'll see here, when you log off, you're going to receive a Zoom survey. It's just going to pop up, and this will allow you to share some really quick feedback. We use this to basically think about what is really valuable to you and to our community. And so if you can take just a couple of minutes to let us know your thoughts on this presentation, that would be really helpful. We'll share it with the presenters as well. And really, again, this is a great opportunity for you to tell us what you're enjoying about this webinar and what are things that we can improve. So thank you for taking the time to fill out that survey in advance. Our next IM Online will also be on September 15th. And so some of what was covered actually in this presentation is really great segue into next month, which will feature some content around our advisory committees and working groups and more information about how to get involved if you're interested. So please plan to join us next month. And then secondly, on the slide that you have here, as Rob mentioned, we have our wonderful CAMP event coming up, stands for Campus Architecture and Middleware Planning. So this is InCommon's annual conference. It'll take place October 4th through 8th. It's a really great event. Our first 2 days, you'll be hearing a lot from our subject matter experts, panelists, moderators who are incredibly knowledgeable in the space. They've been deep in this world for a while, and so they'll have a lot of great content to share with you. And then we'll transition for the last 3 days into ACamp, kind of our unconference, where you, the attendees, will kind of help set the tone and the agenda setting for our sessions. and just talk through really what's most important to you and what you really want to focus on. So really want to make it about you. It's a great event. There is a link posted in the chat now, so feel free to check it out. There is a link to our schedule that is on the wiki page. So take a look if you can, and if you're interested in joining, we highly recommend you sign up soon and you'll get on our list for more updates to come. So that's what we have for now. Again, thank you everybody for joining. We'll see you next month for I Am Online in September, and hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.